On a hot summer's night, you might wonder, why on earth did Hashem create mosquitoes? And for that matter, the sages ask, why did Hashem create frogs? Apparently, they played a very pivotal role in the downfall of Mitzrayim. The question is, why the frogs more than any of the other plagues? Halakosu, Vayomer Hashem Moshe Boy Pari B'Martel of Gomer, commenting on the pasuk that says that Hashem tells Moshe to go speak to Pari and tell him, if you don't send the Jewish people free, I'm going to smite your entire borders with frogs. So the Medrash has this comment. Is a Medrash. It's in relation to this that Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, "V'yisrein oretz b'kolhi." The advantage of the land of earth is in all areas. And then the Gemara quotes Rabbi Chanina, who says as follows. What does this pasuk mean? Even those things that appear to be unnecessary, superficial, superfluous in the world, like snakes and scorpions, they're part of the creation and therefore the intention of the creation of the world. In fact, we'll see that the Eibusha told his Nevi'im, what do you think? Do you think that if you don't fulfill my shlichus, I won't have a means of fulfilling my shlichus? The creation is filled with alternatives. I will achieve my mission through a snake, through a scorpion, even through a frog. And I'll prove it to you, and he's going to bring two proofs. If not for those wasps that shot poison into the eyes of the Emorim, which refers generally to the Canaanim, look at that. If not for them, the Eibishter wouldn't have, so to speak, vanquished the Canaanim. The one we're going to focus on, and if not for the frog, how would the Eibishter have punished the Egyptians? That takes us back to our pasuk, which is the Eibishter telling Moshe to tell Paroi, I'm going to afflict your borders with frogs. Now we have to understand. How can you say such a thing? If not for the frog, how would the Eibishter have punished the Mitzrim? The frogs was only 1 out of 10 plagues. When you're talking about the wasps that attacked the Canaanim before the Jews got into Israel, that was the first salvo to drive the Canaanim out of Eretz Yisrael, because they had these strange wasps that were attacking them from a distance. And it took a tremendous toll on them. As the Chazal tell us both in the Gemara, Rashi quotes it as well, that these wasps didn't even cross into Eretz Yisrael, and they shot their venom from across the Yarden. Rather, it shot this poison into the eyes of the Canaanim, and people died, and of course that totally undid the security of the Canaanim. So we understand that the wasps played a very pivotal role in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. But can you say something like that about the frogs? Firstly, it wasn't the first plague against the Egyptians, and it wasn't severe as the first plague. The first plague was blood, which was a much more severe plague for the Egyptians. Not only because they had no water to drink, because it had all turned into blood, both the water of the rivers and the Nile and of the other rivers, but the entire economy depended on a viable Nile delta, and if all of that turned to blood, that's the end of the country. Besides that, there were another 8 plagues that the Eibishter afflicted the Egyptians with. And you cannot ignore, of course, the last pivotal makkah, which was the hammer blow that brought them to the point that they left Egypt, the death of the firstborns. After all of those were over, there was still more to come. The ultimate price that the Egyptians paid was at Yam Suf, when no Egyptians, at least from the military, were left. How does the Medrash then make a suggestion, were it not for the frogs, how would David have afflicted the Egyptians? Well, it seems that he did a very effective job. Besides the broader question, which is, fundamentally, how could you suggest, how can you ever suggest to the Eibishter that if he didn't have this methodology, his hands were tied? If not for the frog, how would he have punished the Egyptians? The Eibishter has an untold arsenal of shluchim that he could use. And is there anything that is beyond the Eibishter that could prevent the Eibishter from fulfilling his objectives? Doesn't seem to make sense. To get a handle on this, we're going to go a little bit back into the Medrash to see another opinion, the opinion of the Chachamim Bichlal, that precedes Rabbi Acha's opinion. So early in the Medrash it quotes, Rabbi Seinu Omrin, our rabbis generally said, what does the pasuk mean when it says that the land has this abundance of greatness? So Chazal explain that even if there are things that appear to be superfluous in the world, could go in, for example, zvuvim, parushim, bitushin, flies, fleas, and mosquitoes. They're part of the Eibishter's creation and therefore part of the plan. So now what's the difference between what the Chachamim are saying and what Rabbi Acha said? So we're now going to distinguish between what the Chazal are saying generically and what Rabbi Acha is specifying. Plus, in Rabbi Acha's own comment, we're going to separate it into two parts. That those things that you think have no value have a value, and there are those that can fulfill his shlichus. So by Pashtus, what it's telling us simply is this. The minute you acknowledge that anything is part of the Eibishter's creation, we're not just simply saying that the Eibishter made them and they didn't come out of thin air. But we're saying there is a benefit in their creation and a benefit to humans in the fact that they were creation. That's where the Chazal speak and tell us, even those things that appear not to have a meaningful role to play in creation, like the flies, the fleas, and the mosquitoes, they were created for a purpose, a benefit. And they fit into the overarching principle, which is whatever the Eibishter created, he didn't create anything for no purpose. Like, for example, the Gemara tells us that you could use flies as a means of curing insect bites, wasp bites, and the mosquito you could use for snake bites. Then Rabbi Acha says, not only that, not only are there creatures in the world that you think have no purpose, but they actually have a value. Rabbi Acha says, but even things that not only seem to have no value, but they seem to have a negative value because they are pests, they are dangerous. They also have a benefit for us. Because, as the Gemara Shabbos tells us, that there are some times where what appears to be dangerous to us actually protects us from a greater threat. Like, for example, the one kind of creature that scares off an elephant, the Gemara says, etc. So what have we got? We've got, first of all, the things that you think have no benefit, they have a benefit. The things that you think are only dangerous, they also could protect us sometimes. And Rabbi Acha says a third thing, which is something even more surprising than what we've already learned. Not only are there things that are dangerous or poisonous or toxic that could have a benefit, but rather it's those dangerous creatures that could actually be the Eibishter's representatives to fulfill a particular mission, like in this case, to punish the Rishoyim. Okay, so now if this is true, we have a few questions, particularly about the frog. We need to understand. Number one, Aleph. If Rabbi Acha's main innovation is to teach us that even dangerous creatures have a purpose in creation, and the Eibishter uses dangerous creatures for his benefit, for his missions, if that's the case, it's going to raise 3 points. First of all, why? Why does he mention a frog? Frogs are generally not dangerous. Okay, you have the poison arrow frog in South America, but generally frogs are not dangerous. You certainly do not classify frogs in the same category as snakes and scorpions. Not only does he mention frogs, bays, the way he mentions the frogs makes it sound like it's even more surprising that they have a to'eles than the snakes and scorpions, because he says that he could even use a frog. Not only a snake, which everybody is afraid of, not only a scorpion, which everybody realizes is poisonous, but even a frog. Why even a frog? And lastly, Gimel, and which one does he bring a proof that it actually works in humans' favor or to fulfill the Eibishter's mission. He quotes not the snake, not an example of a snake or a scorpion, an example of a frog. The plague of frogs. Doesn't say a word about how snakes or scorpions could have a benefit to the Jewish people, to the Eibishter's mission, even if such things happen in Torah. As other midrashim actually mention that the snakes and the scorpions participate in other parts of the Makos. Second question, generally speaking, which is a very big question. How could Rabbi Acha say that the Eibishter says to the Nevi'im, if you don't do mashlichus, then I have other ways to do it, like, for example, the snakes and the frogs? What's the commonality between what a Navi is supposed to do and what these creatures are supposed to do? Isn't the purpose of snakes, scorpions, frogs, etc. to punish bad people? Whereas the role of a Navi is not to punish, but rather to communicate the Eibishter's message. As the expression goes, that the Eibishter expresses or clarifies or reveals his message through his Nevi'im. If that's true, then what does the Medrash mean when it says that the Eibishter tells the Nevi'im, if you don't do mashlichus, then I'm going to enlist the snakes and even the frogs to do your shlichus. It's a different shlichus. How do they come to connect it all? Well, in the context of Mitzrayim, maybe the shlichus is not so different. Maybe the explanation is this. We know that the plagues in Egypt were not there simply to punish the Egyptians. Rather, the Torah clarifies for us that it was to make awareness in Mitzrayim that the Eibishter is in charge, that the Eibishter is God. In other words, that the Eibishter, another dimension of godliness that they were unaware of, a higher dimension of godliness, should become apparent to them. And in order to achieve that, they had to have the Makos, which would break Mitzrayim and their perception of the world in order to reveal godliness in the world. Now that's a huge clue to us, because once you acknowledge that, then once we acknowledge that Paro's Egypt had a unique kind of klippa, which is unlike other brands of klippa, therefore you needed a unique creature in order to break that klippa, and that's the role of the frog. But what we can see over here as the connection between the job of Nevi'im, which is to advertise the Eibishter's message to the world, and the job of the Makos, which is to advertise the Eibishter to Mitzrayim, you can see a commonality. But what's the role of the frog? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand the unique nature of the spiritual barriers that Mitzrayim put up against Hashem. And in order to understand that, we need to understand that, generally speaking, in Klippa, there are three levels of rejection of Hashem. Generally speaking, nations of the world rejected the Eibishter at three different levels, and we're going to see them in descending order. So the best version of nations of the world who reject Hashem is Aleph. They only reject the fact that the Eibishter is absolute and the only entity. But they acknowledge that the Eibishter is the super God over all the other entities that exist. That means that they're acutely aware of the fact that the Eibishter is the source of their sustainability, their life. And therefore they will not reject Hashem. They'll just say there's a collective, and the Eibishter is the CEO of the whole collective of deities. Even Bilam said that, I cannot go against what the Eibishter wants. So he doesn't dedicate himself to the Eibishter, but he cannot reject the Eibishter. That's level 1. Level 2, a notch lower. They acknowledge there is a God, and the Eibishter is in charge of all the other powers that be. But what they reject is that everything depends on Hashem in order to exist, in order to live. Like Parah says in the words of the Nabi Yecheskel, Li ye'oiri v'ani asisini, that the river, the Nile, is mine, and I made myself. In other words, there's no Eibishter who made me. Yes, there's an Eibishter, but the Eibishter didn't make me. I made myself. Self-made man. The fact that he acknowledges that the Eibishter is the super God, Is only to say that there's something more powerful than me, but I'm one of the gods, I'm one of the deities, as Paru believed himself to be. But his perception is that his own existence is not dependent on that Elakad Delakaya. That Eibishter doesn't have to make me exist, I make myself exist. And then you get the lowest level, Gimel, Eila Machishan, who outright reject the fact that the Eibishter exists, like Sancherev, who's considered to be this great apostate, this great rejecter of godliness, and he rejected the principle that the Eibishter is in fact the God over all other powers. So it would appear that the Sancherev mindset is the worst of all, but it's not that simple. If you look at all three of these perspectives, what would be most apparent is that the third category, who outright reject Hashem, must be the worst of the lot. Because after all, they completely reject the notion of God. But when you look at it from a different perspective, the perspective that says, I made myself, is even worse, even worse than the person who rejects Hashem outright. How? Why would that be? The explanation is this. The first group of people, who acknowledge that the Eibishter is the God over all the other powers that be, they understand and appreciate that the Eibishter is the source of life, and I exist only because of the Eibishter. And therefore they will not rebel against Hashem, and that's obviously a more advanced version of spiritual awareness. So what's key about them is they acknowledge that the Eibishter exists. That's their accolade. They acknowledge that Hashem exists. Here's the interesting thing. Even the person who's in the worst category, what we call the third worst category, the fact that they feel the compulsion to have to reject the Eibishter, to reject that Hashem exists, that tells you that it bothers them. Somehow the Eibishter is a reality in the world that they have to stand up against and deny. That's why their goal and objective is reject Hashem, because Hashem is bothering me. Therefore, I have to speak out loudly to reject Hashem. That's like the Jew who says, I don't believe in God. You want me to prove it? I'll eat chazar on Yom Kippur. Well, if there's no God, what's the difference if it's Yom Kippur and chazar? The very fact that they are engaged in this vigorous rejection of Hashem, that in itself is evidence to the fact that there's an Eibishter. And not only is there an Eibishter, there's an Eibishter that infects these people in this lowly spiritual state. Paroi is a complex psychology. Paroi says, I made myself. Saying that he's saying that his existence is his own production. So you look at Paroi, if you believe his story, he in no way points to the fact that there's a God, not by accepting Hashem's ultimate authority, nor by rejecting it, because he's saying, it's just me. Because the fact that there is a concept that the Eibishter is the superpower over all other powers is not relevant in his life, because his life is self-propelled, self-made. He sees himself as, I created myself. He feels that he is absolutely independent of the Eibishter. So Paroi, in his life, in the way that he manifests himself in the world, points in no way towards the Eibishter. The one who says Elakad recognizes the Eibishter. The one who's Chiref recognizes that there's an Eibishter he's fighting against. Paroi says, there's just me. That's where it begins and ends. So, in the same way as there are now these three categories of either awareness or rejection of godliness, corresponding to that, there are three kinds of creatures that you and I think don't really have a value in this world, and they correspond to three levels of, so to speak, not having a value. In other words, the fundamental principle is what David created, not one thing is wasted. Which should be logical to any thinking person. Any action that David takes must be to achieve a specific, meaningful purpose. And whatever the purpose is, must reflect in the creation that he made, which is not unlike a human being. I mean, if a human being designs an implement for a particular purpose, you look at the design of the implement, you could recognize its purpose. If that's true of humans, how much more so of the Eibishter? Right? If that's how it is with humans, that you can tell by the design of what a human being makes, what its purpose is, for sure you could say the same about the Eibishter's creation. Now, the Eibishter didn't only create things to be functional, but the purpose of all creation is, as it says in Pirkei Avos, whatever the Eibishter created was only for his honor. Which means every single thing that exists has to exist in such a way that it reveals the Eibishter in the world. How do you see the Eibishter in the world through all the things that exist? Because they must add value to the world. The value that this entity adds is its purpose. By it fulfilling its purpose, that indicates that there's one who made this implement, who made this creation. And you could see not only did Eibishter make this thing, but he has a purpose which is reflected in the life of this thing. Now, does that always glare out at us? The way that the Eibishter actually created the world is not everything shouts out its purpose. And the reason the Eibishter did this is to keep us with the ability to make choices and to be able to serve the Eibishter. Otherwise, it would be far too easy if everything was declaring its purpose. So those things that do not outwardly express a divine purpose, they could fall into three categories. Category 1, Rabbi say no amrin, the generic category that the Chazal introduced in the beginning of the Medrash. Even those things that seem to have no value in the world, like flies and fleas and mosquitoes. Doesn't appear that they contribute any value to existence. In Hene, says the Medrash, you have to clarify. They're part of the creation. That Eibishter saw everything that he did, which includes the flies, the fleas, and the mosquitoes. And he said about all of them, it's all exceptionally good. That means to say, they're not wasted beings. As the Gemara explains, the Eibishter created the fly because he used the fly as an antidote to the sting of the wasp, etc. Because everything has a meaningful purpose to fulfill, therefore they all fit into the category of whatever the Eibishter created is for his honor. Through everything that the Eibishter created, the Eibishter is shared with the world, revealed in the world. So that's level 1. You think something has no value. No, it has a value. Level 2. Rabbi comes along and tells us, not only are there creatures that seem not to contribute positively to existence, but as far as the eye can see, they actually appear to go against anything of value because they're dvarim hamazikim. They only seem to cause pain and danger. Like snakes and scorpions. They also play a role. Which means they also fit into the category that they're there for the Eibishter's honor, because the Eibishter doesn't create anything that's not for his honor. In other words, to reveal godliness in the world. Because the fact that they have a role to play in the world, even if it appears to be a negative role, similar to the person who rejects the Eibishter, that illustrates that these are not creatures who just think, I exist for myself, but rather they are, in a sense, like Sancherev, saying, I'm here to fight positive in the world. So Sancherev rejects the Eibishter, which in itself is evidence to the Eibishter. These creatures bring pain into the world, or suffering into the world, danger into the world, so therefore they give evidence to the fact that there's something to create danger to, something of meaning that could chas v'shalom be attacked. And now we can understand really what Rabbi Acha was saying, comparing these creatures and the Nevi'im. That David just says to the Nevi'im, what do you think? If you're not going to fulfill my mission, I have nobody to fulfill the mission. The world is full of opportunities. I could choose to use a snake. I could choose to use a scorpion. In other words, Rabbi Acha is now giving us another layer of insight. Not only are these creatures that cause pain and suffering and danger, not only are they there as the opposition to something viable, not only do they have no purpose, do they have a purpose, unlike you'd imagine they don't, they actually play a role to manifest godliness in the world. Because when they fulfill the Eibish's mission to punish the bad people in this world, that reveals godliness in the world. In a way that is similar to the Nevi'im. Because if, let's say, a snake or a scorpion saves a person's life, as the Gemara suggests the possibility, or even more clearly, when the snakes and scorpions attack and punish those who are wicked in the world, that illustrates that even these things that appear to live in a way that has no value, and in fact live in a way that goes against the Eibish's content and purpose of the world, which is to be really good, you can see actually this is created by the Eibishter. And there's obviously good within these entities. Why do they have good? Either to save somebody's life or to attack the Rishonim. Because they come from the source of all good, which illustrates that you can see the Eibishter's hand and the Eibishter's koyach in this creation. So what have we got? Two categories so far. First category is those things that you think have no value, they have value. Then we have the category of those things that seem to have a negative value. They can even be used for positive, illustrating the tov ma'od within them. And then you get a frog, which doesn't seem to fit into either category. The frog is unique. As far as we're concerned, our understanding, we don't see what a frog contributes to the Eibishter's creation. There doesn't seem to be a benefit to the humans, nor does there seem to be a threat to the humans. Frog does not appear to be a creation that is evidence of its creator. Or at least the awareness that it could in some way illustrate the creator. Doesn't seem to have that. That's why Rabbi Acha says not only can the Eibishter reveal his intent through a snake and a scorpion, but even a frog, which is more surprising. And that's why he says, if not for the frog, how would the Eibishter have punished the Mitzrayim? So, what happened? How did this awareness, because remember, Mitzrayim is a place that doesn't have awareness of the Eibishter. They reject the Eibishter. So how do they come to have this awareness? So you have You've got this frog, which doesn't seem to express any evidence of the Eibishter. Like you've got the Mitzrayim, who don't seem to express any evidence of the Eibishter. To the contrary. This is a nation led by a person who says, we exist because we exist. I made myself. How do we reveal to that mindset that believes nothing exists from an external force? We are all so to speak, self-created. How do you reveal to them that the Eibishter is the ultimate? And in fact, taking it much more deeper and subtler, how do we illustrate to Paroi that your mental capacity, your psychological perception that allows you to believe that you exist of your own volition, that's only possible because the life force inside of you comes from through many evolutionary processes, from ultimate life, from the Eibishter, who is the truest being, the truest life force that actually lives as you're claiming. In other words, how do you have the psychological misguided perspective that you think you live of your own accord? That's because you're plugged in, even though it's so far removed from you, because it's gone through so much ishtalshlus and so much evolution, but you're plugged into the Eibishter, who's mitzius miatzmos, who can truly say, I am because I am. And that's filtered through into your brain. So how do we illustrate to you that instead of your misguided perception that you actually created yourself, that it's all completely dependent on the Eibishter, who is mitzius miatzmos? But as we always say, generally speaking, how is it the possibility of creating something that feels itself as an independent entity is only because that's B'koach Atzmos, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. What's the catalyst to wake the Egyptians up to that reality? The frog. Because out of all the creatures on this earth, the frog is the one, as mentioned, that doesn't appear to have any real contribution. I feel like not even like the mosquitoes that they drive us absolutely crazy. But the Gemara says you could use the mosquito to deal with a wasp sting. They don't seem to have any value. They don't even seem to have a negative value. They don't seem to be pests. They don't seem to be dangerous. It appears as if they have no reason to exist. Therefore, when those frogs that appear to have no benefit to creation now become the soldiers of the Eibishter's mission in this story, of dismantling Egypt, and with the greatest level of self-sacrifice beyond any other creature in the Makos, as we well know from the Medrash that says, as we know that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah worked out if the frogs that don't have consciousness and don't have an obligation to the Eibishter jumped into the Egyptian ovens, we certainly, in a case of Avodah Zarah, or the threat of Avodah Zarah, should jump into the furnace of Nebuchadnezzar. That's what the Eibishter used to dismantle Mitzrayim. Remember, we said earlier that the goal of the Makos is not to punish Egypt as much as to dismantle the misguided perspectives of Egypt, to allow the Eibishter to be revealed in that place, and that Tzfardea is the best way to do it. The frog, which is a unique creature, broke the unique klippa of Mitzrayim, which is Li Yo'ori V'ani Asisini, I made myself. When the Mitzrayim see frogs serving the Eibishter, it helps them realize that the Eibishter is in control. And then they recognize that the source of all existence, including the frog's existence and including their existence, is not only Elikim, a natural dimension of godliness, but Havaya, the absolute level of godliness. And then that breaks Mitzrayim and allows the Yidden to go free. And as they went out of Mitzrayim, then we should go out of this goddess with Mashiach now.